Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to my Chinese colleagues and students. I hope you can hear me well. If you cannot hear me, please say so. Um, Welcome to this new class of our course in the advanced seminar in critical semiotics. We have already gone through a certain number of topics. We have introduced the general field of semiotics. We have then defined what we mean by critical semiotics. And subsequently, we have tackled one issue in particular, which is the issue of a semiotic ideology or semiotic ideologies. And we have devoted several lessons to this topic, together with some guests that have intervened into our course, dealing with different themes, but always from the point of view of a semiotics, critical semiotics, and a cultural analysis of a semiotic ideologies. So today, as it is stated in the a program of this course, we are going to delve into a further topic, which is space. We have already focused on agency, we have focused on time. We're going to concentrate now on another important fundamental coordinate of the human creation of meaning. These concepts, agency, time, space, are central in the history of philosophy, are central in the reflection of many disciplines. What is important to understand is that critical semiotics can add something new, a novel approach to the study of these coordinates. So I'm talking to you from a different setting. You don't see any bookshelves behind me. You see actually an empty bookshelf and a glimpse of a kitchen. I am now in Freiburg, in Germany, where I'm a visiting professor for 6 months. And so I'm talking to you from this new space. Now, what can we say about this space, the space from which I'm talking to you? Well, of course, you can describe it, you can architecturally define it. If you were here, you could take notice of the shape of the room from which I'm talking to you. You could take notice of the objects that are comprised in the furniture of this room. You could also go into more subtle details. You could, for instance, try to understand what is the quality of light in this room. But could we ask ourselves, could we wonder whether there is a specific ideology of space which is present in this room, which is at work in this room, which is functioning even implicitly in this room? Well, the tone of my voice today is a little bit lower than the tone of the voice that I usually have. This is partially because this is an apartment, it's not my home, it's not my house. I have neighbors, I have new neighbors whom I don't know beyond the walls of my apartment, but also because space comes with its sounds, and it comes also with a specific semiotic ideology of the frontiers of space. So if I'm speaking with a lower voice to you today, it is also because I know that the semiotic ideology of space in Germany is slightly different than the semiotic ideology of space in Italy, which is connected with the way in which the bodies are into space, with the way in which these bodies produce sounds, and also with the way in which these sounds can propagate through space. Now, of course, you can probably realize that this difference consists fundamentally in the relation between what is inside a space and what is outside of it. The sounds that are produced privately in this private space and the way in which they are perceived outside of it. If you have an opportunity to come to Germany and visit Germany and enter a German apartment and live in a German apartment, and then you also have an opportunity subsequently to go to Italy and to enter an Italian apartment and live there, you'll immediately realize that something changes in the quality of sounds that compose the space in which you are. The sounds that you will be surrounded with in this city, Freiburg, are different from the sounds you'll be surrounded with in a city like Turin, for instance, in Italy, where I normally live. And try today, when you go back home, to consider also the sounds that connect your environment with your body, with your space, also in the city where you live, Shanghai, or certain areas of Shanghai. Now, this is just a very simple example to let you know that semiotics has a particular perspective on space. Again, you remember when we talked about the ideologies of time, we underlined the fact that for semiotics, what is important is not the study of physical time, is not the study of biological time, it is not the study of the time that we can measure. Of course, semiotics understands and acknowledges the fact that there is this time, but what is really important is the way in which this time is transformed into meaning, is transformed into something that turns into matter of signification. The same goes for space. I mean, space as well is a physical entity. And it is something that from a certain point of view we can perceive spontaneously, even more quickly than we perceive time. We have the impression that we can grasp space, we have the impression that we can measure space. We have the impression that our relation with space is actually many times more immediate than our relation with time. Our body continuously changes through time. The biological functioning of our body continuously changes with time, and this gives us an immediate, a compelling sign of what time is. But at the same time, the relation we have with space, and especially the relation that we have with our bodies with space, is such that we immediately feel that we are in a space, that we are in a place, that we occupy a space. Now, again, this is the physical, measurable dimension of space, but what is important from the point of view of semiotics is not this extension of space. It is not the measurable dimension of space, it is the way in which space turns into meaning, turns into the spatial setting, the spatial theater for a series of processes of significations. So, going back to our previous example, of course, I can measure this room. I can know, for instance, how many square meters this room is. I can know and measure how many cubic meters this space is. And I can also, of course, measure sound. I have an app on my iPhone that measures the decibels, which is the physical measurement unit for sounds. But nevertheless, even if I have all these measurements, even if I have all these figures and these quantities, how many square meters, how many cubic meters this room is, even if I have a measure of the decibels of sound in this room, this will not give me a very precise and effective, informative insight into the culture of space in Germany as compared with the culture of space in Italy. It will not give me any effective, informative insight into the culture of sounds in Germany as compared with the culture of sounds in Italy. Indeed, what I'm looking after is trying to understand what is the semiotic ideology behind the construction of such space and the semiotic ideology behind the construction of these sounds. Now, the immediate perception that you might have in this comparison, if you travel first to Italy and then to Germany, is that Italy is much louder than Germany. And you'll probably be more familiar with the soundscape. A soundscape is a landscape composed of sounds. The landscape of Italy than with the landscape of Germany. Chinese cities, Chinese neighborhoods can be very lively too, can be very loud as well. This is something that is also the matter of accusations and stigmatizations among countries and citizens of different countries and members of different cultural communities. Italians are very loud, Spanish people are very loud, and so on and so forth. On the contrary, we would say Swedish people are very quiet, Finnish people are extremely quiet, Finnish cities are very silent. Now, most people just say these things as elements of common sense, stereotypes on people and cities, but as all stereotypes, they also contain an element of truth. It is true that on average Italians are very noisy. It is true that on average Italian cities are very noisy. It is true that on average Finnish, Estonian, Swedish cities are much quieter. There are of course exceptions. I'm an Italian person, for instance. I come from Italy, but I don't consider myself as a very loud person or a very noisy person. I like silence, I like quiet. So there are exceptions, but these exceptions confirm somehow the stereotypes. But the question we should ask ourselves as semioticians is, why is it so? Why is it that there is a quality of sound and a quality of soundscapes in German cities or in German apartments that is different from the quality of sound, from the soundscapes in Italian spaces, in Italian apartment, for instance? Why is it so? This is very difficult to explain. To explain why certain cultures are louder than certain others. But of course, a lot has to do with a discipline that we have already introduced in the previous classes. I don't know if you remember, the discipline called proxemics. Proxemics is a branch of semiotics that studies the social meaning of space, and in particular the social meaning of distance. Um, uh, H.S. Hall, a very famous scholar in cultural studies, is considered as the one who has introduced first proxemics. And proxemics is about the meaning of space. It is about the social meaning of space, and in particular, it is about the social meaning of distance. So, to summarize, space is a very important coordinate of human life. We are probably biologically hardwired, endowed with a cognitive system to apprehend the environment also through this coordinate, the coordinate of space. As human beings, we immediately realize that we are surrounded by a space, that we are surrounded by a certain space, that is, by a place. At the same time, this universal innate ability of human beings of acting through this coordinate and behaving through this coordinate and interacting with the environment through this coordinate is again inflected by local cultures of space, by semiotic ideologies of space, which differ from culture to culture, but also differ through time. So the semiotic ideology of space in Italy today is certainly different than the semiotic ideology of space in Italy 2 centuries ago or 3 centuries ago. So that's why, although we can measure space, although we can relate to space as a physical coordinate that we can quantify, what is important for semiotics is not space as an extension, but space as a discourse. What matters is the encounter between space and language, the way in which language articulates a certain space and gives rise to a certain semiotic ideology of space. It is influenced by this semiotic ideology, but at the same time it gives rise to it. So there are different disciplines that deal with space. Of course, a fundamental discipline that deals with human space is architecture. If this room has a certain shape, if this environment, this space from which I'm talking to you has a certain space, it is so because an architect has decided to give this particular room the shape that it has. Now, you should know that the apartment where I'm living is in a building which is quite old. It's a building that was built at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And if you were here, you could appreciate that the ceiling of this room is very, very high. You know, it's probably more than 6 meters, and that this room is very wide. So this room has certain characteristics. It is square, it is very spacious, the ceiling is very high, the room is quite wide, but it is so in comparison to the way in which normal apartment rooms manifest themselves, show themselves nowadays. So what has happened to space in Germany, but also in Europe, since the beginning of the 20th century until our present time, the beginning of the 21st century? Well, the space, the physical space allotted to individual has somehow shrank. So normal apartments nowadays would not be built this way, would not be built with these high ceilings, would not be built with these spacious rooms. They would be built with much lower ceilings and much smaller rooms, partly for economic reasons, because space is becoming and more expensive resource, especially in university cities, in cities around the world, including Shanghai. But the economic reason is not the only one. The economic reason is also connected, intertwined, inextricably intertwined with a cultural reason. And the reason is that it is okay for present-day human beings to live in apartments that are much smaller than before, whereas spaces of this kind, like this room, would be much more common and convenient, judged as convenient before. So from the semiotic point of view, we should ask ourselves, why is it so? Why is it that the culture of, let's say, domestic architectural space changes throughout time? And why is it that also some material elements of space change? If this room is so quiet, is it so, let's say, soundproof? It is also because there are very good ceilings, very good windows, very good doors. I don't hear my neighbors, and my neighbors do not hear me. This is because we are in a cold country, of course, and it is necessary to protect the environment from the outside temperatures. That would not be the case in Italy. If you go to southern Italy, you won't come across the same windows, you won't come across the same doors. But there is something more. There is something that is deeper and deeply ingrained with the semiotic ideology that has produced these doors, that has produced these windows, and that has produced also these walls with their specific thickness, with their specific sound proofness. This semiotic ideology has to do with how individuals are seen in their relation with society. Indeed, there are certain societies in which the individual is more prominent and preeminent than the community, and there are other societies and cultures in which, on the contrary, the community matters more than the individual. On the one hand, you have the concept of community, being together, individuals sharing meaning, space, time, the materiality of signification. And as a concept which is opposite to community, you have the concept of immunity, that is the separation of individuals from other individuals, the separation of their time, their space, the materiality of signification. Now, this opposition, immunity, community, is fundamental. It was developed by an Italian philosopher called Roberto Esposito. I should probably tell you something about the etymology of these two words, the etymology of the word immunitas and the etymology of the word communitas. Now, the etymology of a word not always coincides with the meaning of a word, but it tells us something about the history of the word and how it might have acquired the meaning that it actually has. So, what is the etymology of the word communitas? Community, which is the same etymology that you find in a word that is very important in China, which is communism. Communism has the same etymology of a community, communitas. We could say even that communism is the political ideology that stresses the importance of the community over the individual, the community over the immunity. So, what is the origin of this word? Where in this word, communitas in Latin, community in English, we find a Latin word, and this Latin word is munus, munus, M-U-N-U-S. What does munus means in Latin? It means gift. It means present. You find this root, this lexical root, also in some English word, which are a little bit difficult, like munificent. Munificent. What does munificent means? Munificent is someone who is very generous, who gives many presents, who gives a lot of money, for instance, a lot of gifts or presents to other people. Being munificent means being extremely generous. So munus means present, means offer, means gift. But why do we have the word munus, present, gift, within the etymology of the word communitas, community? What has to do? What has the gift, the present, the fact of being generous has to do with the fact of being in a community, being a member of a community? Well, the idea that is developed by contemporary philosophers like Roberto Esposito and others is that in order for an individual to be part of a community, it is fundamental that this individual gives up a part of his or her individuality. So in a way, in order to enter a community, in order to become a member of a community, in order to partake in a community, I must give as a sort of a present to the community itself, to the idea of the community itself, at least a part of my individuality. I have to relinquish, I have to give up a part of my individuality, and I have to relinquish, I have to give up as a consequence a part of my feeling and sense of immunity, of immunitas. So being member of a community means, for instance, that I cannot always do whatever I want. I must negotiate with other people. I must negotiate with the other members of the community. I must negotiate because I cannot express my desires all the time. My desires must be compromised with the desires of other people. You know, it's like when you go on a travel, well, now it's difficult to travel because of the pandemic, but when this is over, we'll all travel again. And if you travel solo as an individual, if you take a journey on your own, a solitary journey, well, more or less, you'll be able to do whatever you want. You will be able to arrange your journey as you want. You will be able and free to do whatever you want, to like eat, not to eat, to travel, to rest, to go to such a city instead of another, and so on and so forth. But as soon as you travel with another person, and even more when you travel with a group of people, with two people, three people, with a small community, then your wishes as an individual traveler, as a solo traveler, will have to be constantly compromised with the wishes, desires, the intentions, the plans of the other members of the traveling community. In a traveling community, in a group that travels together, the travelers who compose this group cannot do whatever they want all the time. They must compromise and find a common ground with the other members of the traveling group. So you see, being part of a community means giving up a part of one's intentions, desires, wishes, plans, and so on and so forth, in order to give shape to this group, which is more than an individual, which is more than the sum of many single, isolated individuals. It is another social entity. What is immunitas, on the contrary? Well, immunity, from this perspective, is exactly the opposite as a communitas, community. Immunity takes place whenever I don't want to compromise with other people. I don't want to negotiate with other people. I don't want to limit my desires, my wishes, so that they can be composed with desires and wishes of other members of the community. I want to be on my own, and I do whatever I can to isolate myself from the rest of the world in order to protect my wishes, in order to protect my desires. Now, what has this to do with a space and the semiotic ideologies of space? Well, I'll give you an example. You certainly take trains in China. Trains are probably the most common transportation means in China. China has a wonderful network of railways that reach even the remotest cities. Fast trains in China are among the fastest in the world. Myself, I've been enjoying a lot traveling through to China by train. I really love the Chinese train stations and Chinese trains. I can't wait to go back to China and travel by train again. This is my favorite means of transportation. Trains are very important in Italy too. The railways in Italy reach even very remote villages. It has been historically a very important means of transportation. It has contributed to unify the country and so on and so forth. But of course, technology has evolved in trains as well. Trains are much faster nowadays. They're probably much more they are much safer nowadays than they were in the past. But what has changed in trains, if you compare, let's say, trains in Italy in the 1960s or 1970s, when I was a kid, a child, and I would travel by train with my parents. If you compare those trains in the 1970s with present-day trains in Italy, what has changed? It's not only the technology, it is not only the speed, it is not only the safety of these trains. What has changed is also the way in which the space of these transportation means is arranged, lived, experienced, and turned into meaning. Why is it so? Well, of course, you cannot take a train on your own unless, I don't know, you are the Queen of England or a very powerful person. But normally, normal people must actually take a train together with other people. This is the basic concept of a transportation, public transportation means. You know, this is why, for instance, trains are very unpopular and are very underdeveloped in strongly individualistic societies. You know, if you ask an average US citizen, probably he has taken the train very rarely because, you know, for the United States, what matters is the car where you can isolate yourself and travel on your own. But even if you consider trains only, if you were given the possibility to enter a 1970s train, an Italian 1970s train, how would the interior space of this train look like? Well, characteristically, you would go up into the train, climb the ladders, and enter the wagon, the coach, and there would be a corridor, and then beside the corridor there would be many compartments, and in these many compartments there would be characteristically 6 seats arranged in ranges of 3 and 3 seats opposite each other, or 4 seats if you would go to the first class. So this was a train in the 1970s. You would have a corridor, and then you would have some compartments. Now, what was the idea behind this train interior space architecture in the 1970s? Well, the idea was that the wagon, the coach, was a little bit like an apartment. So you would have a corridor, and then you would have a series of rooms adjacent to the corridor. And as a consequence, going into a train would be a little bit like going into a prolongation of your own apartment, a public or semi-public moving prolongation, extension of your own apartment with a corridor and some rooms. And within each of the compartments adjacent to the corridor, people would sit one in front of the other. So there would be 3 people on this side and 3 people on that side. In many countries around the world which have kept this traditional train interior design, space architecture, you'll find the same. If you go to Morocco, for instance, if you travel with Moroccan trains, you'll find this arrangement. And still nowadays, in old slow trains in Italy, you'll find this interior architecture. So what does this architecture say to you? Well, it says that these wagons, these coaches, were seen as a prolongation, an extension of one's apartment, but also the idea was that people in these trains were not meant completely as individuals. They were meant as micro-communities. So they would be sitting in these compartments, facing each other, so that actually having a conversation with strangers in an Italian train in the 1970s was extremely common. Well, of course, there weren't any mobile phones, there weren't devices which are devices commonly used also to isolate oneself from the environment. But, if you watch movies from 1970s Italy, you'll find that in these movies, people take the train, and in trains, they always come up meeting with other people. They accidentally meet other people, they start conversation with them, sometimes they start love affairs with them, and so on and so forth. So how's the architecture of the interior space, internal space of a train in Italy nowadays? It is completely different. There is a corridor, of course, but the corridor is not on the side. The corridor is in the middle. And then you have some ranges of seats on the right side and on the left side, usually arranged 2 by 2, with some exceptions at the end and at the beginning of the wagon where there are some isolated seats. So the idea is not to have a wagon, a coach, that is conceived, as far as space is concerned, as an extension of your own apartment with a corridor and some rooms. There is another model behind this internal architecture. And this model is essentially the model of the plane, the airplane. Now, in fast trains, you sit exactly as you would sit, more or less, in an airplane. Now, you might think, yeah, but this is just because of the technology of trains. Since trains are much faster now, security systems and security measures must be different, so it's actually better to have people sitting in this new way instead of having people sitting in the previous way. But that is not completely true. You see, the change is not only technological, it's not only due to speed. The change is structural from a Marxist point of view, meaning that in order to sell more tickets and in order to profit more from the traveling of trains, now it is actually better to use the interior space of wagons in a more effective way And using it in a more effective way implies also the fact that you cannot leave a lot of space for divisions among compartments. You can use a lot of space for the corridor. You must allocate the internal space as efficiently as possible, exactly as it happens for planes. So there is the first level, which is the classical Marxist level of structural, let's say, a ground for a cultural phenomena, in order to gain more profit from the fact that more people travel with the same wagon. The space of this wagon is arranged differently. But there is also a superstructural dimension, which is as important as the structural one and actually interacts with it. It is not only for economic reasons that now people sit in trains in a different way. It is also for cultural reasons. I don't want to see the train as an extension of my apartment. I don't want to see the train as an extension of my neighborhood. You see, in the 1970s, when I would take the train with my grandparents in Italy, and I would go into these compartments, well, it was a little bit like being in a village. You know, people were eating, people were talking, people were sometimes fighting, people were singing, people were offering each other food, and so on and so forth. There was a feeling of community, micro-community, that would create itself for the time of a journey in that little space of the compartment. Now, you know, if you take an Italian train nowadays, you are not going to probably talk to anyone, and even less now because we are, of course, increasing our immunity and our immunity inflected usage of space because of the presence of a virus in the environment and the need to protect ourselves with masks. So this is to say that the change of this architectural space is not only due to economic reasons, it's also due to ideological reasons. Now we don't take a train as a community anymore. We take a train as individuals. We take a train as individuals who want to create a spatial space immunity around themselves. And so we have headphones, we have our iPads, we have our iPhones, we have seats that allow us to travel by train without facing anyone. We just face another seat. There is someone beside ourselves, but you know it is separated. We have armrests which are like clearly defined from the armrests of the other person. So you see, there is a technological change which gives rise also to economic change, but this economic change is intertwined with a cultural change, with a different way in which people conceive the space of public transportation. There is no community taking shape in trains anymore nowadays. There is a feeling of immunity. I am alone on this train and I want to stay alone. I don't want to interact with other people because other people, I don't know who they are. I don't know what they might talk about, etc., etc. Now, there is an interesting phenomenon when I take trains in China, which is usually shocking for people who come from the West or who come from other countries. This phenomenon is the following. Chinese trains are extremely lively, nevertheless. You know, people, for instance, watch a lot of movies, play with video games, but many times without using headphones. So you have a lot of sounds coming from devices in trains, even speed trains. Now, why is it so? Is it interesting to consider what kind of, let's say, ideology of space gives rise to this kind of phenomenon? I mean, if you took a train here in Germany, one of these speed trains, and you went into one of the wagons of the train with your laptop and you started to watch a movie with high volume without using headphones, they would probably arrest you, but this is not because the laws are different, or this is because the culture of space, the culture of sounds, and also the culture of community and immunity is still different in China than it is in other countries. And we're going to take a little break now, a 10 minutes break. We have already talked for 45 minutes. And we're going to resume at past 5. So in exactly 10 minutes, we're going to try to understand why the soundscape of Chinese trains is different from the soundscape of trains in Germany or in other countries of the world. And this is all about semiotic ideologies of space. Thank you. So, welcome back. A short summary of what we have talked about so far. We are in the field of semiotics, critical semiotics focusing on semiotic ideologies. And after dealing with the concepts of agency and time, we are focusing on space. We are underlining the fact that space is relevant for critical semiotics, not as extension, but as articulation of this extension, which is produced by the contact, the encounter between space and language, the inflection of a certain space according to a semiotic ideology of space, which is central in a given culture. And we were talking about some examples. So we were talking about the interior space of an apartment in Germany as compared to the interior space of an apartment in Italy. But we were also concentrating on the different interior architecture of a public transportation means, why trains in Italy in the 1970s would have an interior space arranged differently than trains in Italy nowadays. We also connected with these two topics, these two dimensions, the dimension of space as a coordinate of human interaction and the dimension of a sound. Of course, the two elements are connected. Why are they connected? Because, you see, we introduced also the opposition between communitas and immunitas, between community and immunity. And how is a feeling of immunitas, immunity, created? Well, it is created basically through barriers, through frontiers, through limits. And many of these barriers, these frontiers, these limits, concern the senses, the 5 senses. How is it, for instance, that I feel part of a community? Well, of course, I can conceptually feel part of a community, but this concept of being part of a community actually comes also from the fact that my own body, when this body is in a certain space, receives a sensorial stimuli that come from the bodies of other individuals. So when I am in a train, for instance, and I'm traveling together with other people, even my body, my own body, is not completely isolated, is not immune to stimuli that are coming from the external environment. I'm actually hearing the voices of other people. I'm hearing the sounds that are made by other people and by their electronic devices nowadays. I'm smelling the smell of other bodies, but also the smell of food, for instance, that people are eating in the train. Sometimes I get in physical contact with other passengers, so even the sense of the touch is stimulated. A passenger might accidentally touch my body. That happens all the time in the metro or in public transportation systems where people are squeezed together. All these senses, and of course the sense of the sight, are stimulated. The only sense that I can completely privatize in a train, in a public transportation mean, is the sense of taste, so which is probably the most intimate sense. So I only decide what to eat and what not to eat. I only decide what to drink and what not to drink. But you see, even the equally intimate sense of olfaction, of smelling, is something that I cannot completely separated and isolated from the external environment. If another passenger eats some food, I will nevertheless smell a little bit that food, and so on and so forth. So when I want to build an immunity system, I usually start from isolating myself and my body from sensorial stimuli that come from the outside. So what happens in modern trains, in present-day trains, what happens is that my sight is isolated from contact with other bodies, because differently from what would happen in 1970s Italian trains, I'm not obliged to look at someone else. I'm not obliged at having the body of another passenger in front of my eyes. The only body that is beside, that is close to mine, is the passenger that is sitting at my right or at my left. But I can easily avoid it. And you see, if you go to luxury coaches in contemporary trains, you will find that the seats have this kind of shell shape, whose purpose is exactly to separate myself and my sight from the possibility of seeing, even with the lateral side of my eyes, the other passengers. So my sight is, my vision is bestowed this sense of immunity by a certain organization of the interior space of the coach, and by the fact that the bodies of passengers are disposed within this space, are arranged within this space, so as to prevent the arising of the feeling of a visual community. We are not traveling together, although we are traveling together, because I don't actually concentrate visually on the other passengers. What I see is the seat in front of myself. What I see is most of the time my screen, the screen on my laptop, the screen on my iPhone. But more and more, technology is used also to isolate myself, not only visually, but also acoustically, from the point of view of the sense of hearing. I have more and more headphones, for instance, the little headphones that I can now put directly as little buds into my ears. But increasingly, these headphones are also endowed with a technology of sound reduction, with the possibility of reducing technologically the sounds that I receive from the environment. You see, our ears function in a very interesting way, because we don't have for our ears the same possibility that we have with for our eyes. You know, our eyes are endowed with a very interesting anatomical device, which is our eyelids. So, you know, I don't like Professor LEONE. I don't like his face. So I can just, you know, shut down my eyelids and listen to his voice, you know, hearing his voice without looking at him. You know, this is something that we can do all the time. We can deny the sight of the environment. We can decide not to see the environment. But this is not something we can do with hearing. We cannot decide not to hear an environment. Well, of course, we can put our fingers in our ears, but this is something that we can do for a limited amount of time, and that isolates us only imperfectly from the environment. Why is it so? Well, probably in the natural evolution of our species, it was very important for members of our species, even when they isolate themselves, even when they would isolate themselves completely from the vision of the environment, and this happens basically every time that we sleep. There are some characters in movies that sleep with one eye open, or characters who, mythical character, like mythical warriors, for instance, that would sleep with their eyes open in order to be alert all the time about the environment. But normal people close their eyes when they sleep. Now, in the natural evolution of the species, it was actually adaptive to give us the possibility to keep a channel always open towards the environment, even when we were with closed eyes, even when we were sleeping. I'm sleeping, my eyes are closed, but nevertheless, if I hear a strange, strong sound, a strange, strong noise in my apartment overnight, I would probably wake up and think, oh, well, there is a thief in my apartment, let me check. So it's very important to protect the sleeping individual, to protect the individual who is visually isolated from the environment itself. But more and more, in trains as in other environments, sophisticated headphones are developed, because what we want to do as individuals now is to go against this natural alertness, this natural porosity, this natural openness that we have towards soundscapes. So we want to technologically reduce the level of sound in the environment when we want to be on our own, when we want to be isolated. You see, this is an interesting technological development. If you take some trains in Switzerland, for instance, or even in Germany, where the semiotic ideology of immunity is very strong, is very present, you will have the possibility to buy tickets in coaches, to sit in coaches which are denominated silent coaches. What are the silent coaches? Now, the silent coaches exist also in other European countries, but in the past, they would not exist in Italy, they would not exist in France, they would exist only in Switzerland. And the idea is that when I buy a ticket for a seat in the specific wagon, in the specific coach, I buy that seat knowing that I'm going to be obliged to stay quiet in that coach, not to speak, not to use any electronic devices, and the other people will be actually obliged to do the same. So all those who buy a seat in that particular coach, they also buy a certain feeling of immunity, the idea that they will be separated from other passengers, not only from the point of view of the sight, the vision, but also from the point of view of hearing. So there's going to be complete silence. Now, this was not present in Italian trains up to a certain number of years ago, but then it was introduced. It was introduced also because with the advent of miniaturized devices for communication, mainly cell phones, then smartphones, then iPads, but also portable computers, we are not individuals anymore traveling in these community transport spaces. We are the nuts of a gigantic network that is traveling with these trains. So in the past, you would have an individual with his or her body entering a train and traveling with other individuals and their bodies in the same train. But nowadays, it is not exactly the same that is happening, because what enters the wagon, what enters the train is not an individual, but an individual which is more than an individual, which is more than an individual body. It is the knot of a cloud, of a network that constantly travels with him. So when he's at home, when he's at work, when he's on the metro, when he's in the train, etc., etc., a cloud, a network of connections which entails the constant possibility of exchanging meaning, of exchanging communication, constantly travels with him. So this means that when I enter the train, I'm not an individual anymore. I'm an individual with a cell phone. I'm an individual with a smartphone. I'm an individual with a laptop. And this means that this gigantic network constantly comes with me. And this network will communicate to me, but I'll have to communicate with this network as well. Of course, I can communicate just by typing messages, but in many circumstances, I will want also to use my voice. So this has given rise to many interesting changes in the semiotic ideology of space and the semiotic ideology of sounds, both in public transportation means and in the space of everyday life in general. We said that more and more technologically advanced headphones are produced, headphones that reduce the level of sound in the environment, because it's not sufficient anymore to buy a ticket in a silent coach. I actually want to control myself the silence of the environment. I do not want to rely on the decisions and behaviors of other people. I want to be sure that I have complete individual control on the sounds of the environment. This is the concept, the ideological concept that is behind this sound reducing, noise reducing headphones of the new generation. But this goes in parallel also with other changes. Now, at the end of the first section of the lecture today, we were wondering, why is it that many Chinese trains are still very lively? But I personally like it, I must say, maybe because I'm Italian and Italy is a noisy country too. But I know that many complain about the fact that the Chinese trains are quite noisy. I actually like it. I find it very lively. It reminds me when I was a child and I would travel with my grandparents and people would eat and joke and talk and so on and so forth. But you see, this is, I think, an important sign to understand the present day culture of China, which is a country, to my mind, of extreme interest from the point of view of cultural semiotics, exactly because, on the one hand, there is the most advanced technology in the world, the fastest trains in the world, the most advanced smartphone technology in the world, probably some of the best sound reducing headphones in the world, the best produced by Apple and Huawei. But at the same time, this technology, this tremendous technological progress has not completely changed the semiotic ideology behind the behaviors of Chinese citizens. So Chinese citizens still feel part of a community, mainly because there is this very strong ideology, which is, of course, the communist ideology that is extremely influential in everyday China. So, although Chinese trains, fast trains, are shaped according to the semiotic ideology of Western European countries, many of them are designed by German designers or German architects or Italian architects. The way in which Chinese people behave in these trains, use these trains, live in these trains, is still according to a feeling of community more than according to a feeling of immunity. So yeah, I take this speedy train, I have my individual laptop, I have my individual smartphone, but when I watch a movie, I don't actually put my headphones on because I don't think that that is going to bother other people, and other people will not probably bothered by my watching this movie because we understand the soundscape that surrounds us not as fragmented into islands, into little sound islands, but as a community soundscape where I receive the sounds of other people and other people receive my own sounds, and these without the idea that I should constantly isolate myself. So, of course, there are pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages in both semiotic ideologies of immunitas and semiotic ideologies of communitas. But what is important to stress is that what creates discomfort is not the presence of sound or the absence of sound. What creates surprise and possibly also a sense of discomfort is the cultural difference. So if a citizen of today Italy were able to travel back in time, back in history, and take a 1970s train, it would be probably amused, but it would be probably also irritated. You know, how come I cannot work? You know, because there are too many sounds, too many people talking, too many people eating, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, that goes both, sorry, not both ways. If you using this magic travel time machine, time travel machine, you could send an individual from a 1970s Italian train to a present day train. Well, this individual would think, what happens? Where are the other people? How come that I'm so alone? How come that everybody's so silent? You know, like, has anyone like died? Because this was, you see, in many traditional cultures, including the Italian one, that was the meaning of silence. You know, silence is something that is connected with the lack of life, with the lack of exchange, with death. So if there is noise, there is life. That's why noise is good. You know? But other cultures interpret noise in a different way, like interpret it as a nuisance to the sensorial immunity and sensorial plans of individuals. But there's another interesting phenomenon which is connected with the changing through time of the semiotic ideologies of a space and also the semiotic ideologies of sound. You see, on the one hand, when I move around the city, when I am in my apartment, when I take the metro, when I take the train, when I go to my office, I'm not only on my own anymore, but I'm connected constantly to a network. You know, my smartphone constantly gives information about myself, where I am, what I might like or desire in a certain time space of the environment. There is constant geolocalization of my movements and so on and so forth. So we are not individual bodies moving into space anymore. We are clouds and knots of networks. A gigantic network constantly moves with us. This, as I said, would not be the case in the past. Of course, you know, taking a train in the 1970s, I could probably already take a little radio with me, and I would be able to receive messages from a radio station broadcasting a certain program, but that would be just in one direction. So I could receive messages from a distant outside, but I could not send messages to a distant outside. You know, the cell phones were not available anymore. So I could have a radio, I could have a book, and the book was also a way to receive a message from space outside and remote, from the place of the traveling body. But again, it was a message that had been enshrined by the writer into the book somewhere else is someone else, and that was silently coming into the coach of the train when I would open the book. Now it is completely different, like if I have a smartphone, I can receive messages from the entire world all the time, but I can also contribute to these networks. I can constantly send not only my voice, but also images, and very soon we'll be probably able to send also very complex contents like three-dimensional images and so on and so forth to the rest of the world. So on the one hand, the individual is becoming more of an individual, meaning that is seeking more and more immunity for his or her body. The individual traveler doesn't want to share a space, visual space, an acoustic space, a sensorial space with other travelers. At the same time, I'm becoming part of a gigantic digital community. So on the one hand, I'm giving up the idea of a physical community, of a sensorial community, of a bodily community, but on the other hand, I'm actually embracing the idea of a gigantic digital community that is always with me. If I'm in bed at night, probably the last thing that I do is to look up the last news or messages or posts in social networks, on WeChat, and so on and so forth, on my cell phone. So even when I'm in the most intimate place, even in my bathroom, even in my bedroom, I'm always followed by this digital community. So we are becoming more and more, in many cultures, immune individuals from the sensorial, bodily point of view, but we are becoming community individuals from the digital point of view. And the important thing to ask is, what is the quality of space? And what is the specific semiotic ideology of space that is behind the two different communities, the bodily, embodied, incarnated, sensorial community on the one hand, and the disembodied, disincarnated, virtual, digital community on the other hand? This is a question that we are asking more and more nowadays, given the fact that many of the traditional embodied communities of our life are also being more and more disembodied and virtualized and digitalized as a consequence of the pandemic. So normally I would probably be in Shanghai, we would be sharing the same room, we would be sharing the same classroom, I would be able to see your body, you would be able to see my body, I would probably be able to hear your voices, even if Chinese students are very quiet and silent, and so on and so forth. But all this has been turned into a digital community. So now we are part of a digital community. But is this disembodied, disincarnated community the same as the embodied, incarnated, present community that we would be part of if I were able to come to Shanghai as always and as customarily and teach in person? Well, of course not. This is something that scholars, starting from a very important US scholar called Joshua Meyrowitz, have understood, studying the relation between media and space. The semiotic ideology of space changes with the changing of media and with the changing of the technology of media. So already the introduction of radio, the introduction of television changed the meaning of space. Beyond the sense of space is a very famous contribution of Joshua Meyrowitz. But the sense of space that will be created by radio, that will be created by television, is very different from the sense of space that is created by cell phones, by laptop computers. Now, there is something that I really like about China. Since I cannot go to China, I'm very nostalgic about it, about your beautiful country. And something I've seen in some cities in China, which I like very much, because again, it reminds me of some scenes that I've seen in Italy, that would be seen in Italy many years ago. For instance, once I was invited by Sichuan University to give a lecture in Chengdu, and I was walking around the city, and I came across a scene that was really fascinating. So there was a television screen outside in a sort of a little square, and there were many people sitting together in front of this television screen and watching a TV program together. You see, this is how television was watched in the beginning of television history in Italy too. In the 1950s, in the 1960s, my grandparents in the 1960s were living in a village in the southern Italy, and not everyone had a TV set. So some families would have more money and would invest in a TV set, and that was a big event. That was big news, because then people from the other families of the same village would go to that house who had, to that home who had a TV set, and they would watch TV together. No, bars would have TVs, and people would go to bars, to cafes, to watch TV together. Now, you can interpret this phenomenon at the beginning of the history of television in purely structural terms, meaning structure in the sense of Marx's Bao as economic structure. So TV sets were very expensive. Only few families, little bourgeois families, could afford buying a TV set. So as a consequence, it was a privileged, a hegemonic, Gramsci would say, device that would be owned only by some people, and the other people would be just spectators, aggregated spectators. But again, this is not the only explanation, because the economic structure, the economic dimension always intertwines with the cultural, with the semiotic dimension. You see, people would go to other families' homes to watch television, or they would go to bars and cafes to watch television, not only because they couldn't afford a TV set. You see, I'll give you another example. Even nowadays, even today that TV sets are everywhere, and sometimes in families you have as many TV sets as there are individuals living in the family. So there is a TV for the father, a TV for the mother, a TV for the kid, and so on and so forth. Or at least this was the case in the 1990s. Now kids do not watch TV anymore. But even in these circumstances, given a proliferation of TVs as an available cheap technology, even nowadays, there are still some circumstances in which people do not want to watch their TVs alone, do not want to be alone in front of their TV screens. What are these occasions? Well, in Italy, these occasions are basically probably just reduced to one circumstance now, and it is when the national soccer football team plays in important games, the World Cup, for instance. So the final game, game of the World Cup, Italy football team, Italy is a soccer football country, and China is as well, better and better. You know probably Lippi, who was the coach of the national Italian team, and now he's coaching in China. So in this circumstance, Italy is in the final of the World Cup. The soccer team of Italy is in the final of the World Cup. I have a TV set at home, but I'm not going to watch the game alone. I'm going to invite people, or I'm going to be invited by people. I will avoid being on my own in front of the TV watching this important game. Why is it so? Well, it is so because that is not a spectacle whatsoever. That is not a TV program whatsoever. That is an important ritual event, which is important not only for the individual, it is important for the community. So if I watch that event as an individual, I don't feel completely satisfied because that spectacle, that TV show, does not exist to satisfy the symbolical needs of an individual. It is there to satisfy the symbolical needs of a community. So that's why even if my technology is perfectly individual and the technological and spatial environment and arrangement thanks to which I can watch television are perfectly immunitarian, so individualizing, in those circumstances, I don't want to be alone. I want to be with other people. I want to be part of a crowd because in that circumstance, I must feel a little bit as though I were in a stadium together with many other people watching that soccer game. So this is to say that even in the beginning of the history of television, where TV sets were very expensive, it is not that people in my grandparents' village, for instance, would go to other homes to watch television only for economic reasons, because they could not afford one. They would go there also because they were modeling their fruition of this new medium, of this new communication technology, following the model of previous media, and in particular following the model of fruition of the medium that was the most popular for a common people in Italy before the invention of television, and this medium was the movie theater. So people would watch the TV set, they would watch television exactly in the same way as they would watch a movie in a movie theater. In a movie theater, traditionally, you would not be on your own. Cinema was invented as a medium for a community. It was not invented as a medium for an individual. Movie theaters, in their turn, were modeled on the spatial and communicative model of theaters. This is why in the US they're called movie theaters. There were theaters in which, instead of having a spectacle of actors and living bodies performing, you would have now a movie, so a film spectacle. But nevertheless, the audience would still be an embodied, collective, community audience that, well, I don't know if you are old enough to have been to a movie theater, or if you have had this pleasure in life, or if you had this habit. Now it's difficult again because of the virus, but otherwise, you remember, going to a movie theater and watching a horror movie, you wouldn't be alone with your emotions. Your emotions would be echoed by the emotions of the other people, and also the embodiment of these emotions would be somehow echoed by the way in which the other bodies of the other spectators would manifest this emotion. So in the big moment of horror, terror of the movie, you would not scream on your own. You would scream together with other people. It was a ritual. It was a community. It was a community building spectacle. Now, what has happened is that at some point, a technology was invented in order to suit specifically and characteristically individual needs. And this technology was the cell phone. The cell phone was a characteristically and specifically individual device. The cell phone was not invented for a community. The cell phone was invented by an individual. Yes, of course, in the beginning of the history of telephone, you also would have situations in which some houses in Italy or elsewhere, I'm talking about 1940s, 1930s, would have the telephone, or the bar would have the telephone, so people would go there to receive calls, or they would go there to make calls. This happens also in some areas in the world which are not technologically advanced. You see, 2 years ago, I was visiting a remote island of Peru, and in that island, the reception of cell phones was very bad. It were mainly shepherds living on the island, and one morning, in order to communicate with my work in Italy, with my office in Italy, I had to climb a hill where there was the reception, and so after climbing that hill, I could actually get some signal, some network, and make my phone call. But as I was making that phone call, I saw these two little shepherds who came toward me because they wanted actually to make a phone call. They didn't have a cell phone, they had to communicate with other shepherds somewhere else. So they asked me if they could borrow my cell phone. But these are exceptional situations. Now, everyone, even kids, have a cell phone. And this was built as a characteristically individual technological device. Now, what has happened, though, is that more and more functions have been added to this characteristically individual device. More and more contents have been added to it, to the extent that now many of the contents, cultural contents, that would go through characteristically communitarian, community embodied social devices like theater, like movie theater, like to a certain extent TV screens, now reach us, and we can attain them, we can reach them through the little screen of our smartphone. At the same time, the smartphone is also the main device through which we connect to this giant digital network that constantly comes with us all the time as we move through space. So you see, there is a contradiction there that explains many of the most interesting cultural phenomena concerning communication, space, and their ideologies in the present time. On the one hand, I am endowed now with a miniaturized device whose original purpose is characteristically individual. I'm the one who is going to talk with this phone, and moreover, I can move around with this phone searching for privacy. Probably you don't realize how having a girlfriend or having a boyfriend would be before the invention of the cell phones. If you wanted to call your girlfriend, or if you wanted to call your boyfriend, or if you wanted to be called by your girlfriend or by your boyfriend, that should happen through the phone of the family. So, like, when your boyfriend or your girlfriend would call, everybody would know, and there were many strategies to somehow hide the fact that your girlfriend was calling you or boyfriend was calling you. But now, not only you have this individual device, but this device is miniaturized and is portable, so you can constantly find a space of immunity where to make calls. And you see, there's an interesting phenomenon in many public transportation means in Italy and everywhere else as well. You have people, passengers, sitting in trains, talking through their cell phones, their smartphones, and talking about extremely private issues, their sentimental affairs, their sexual life, their work problems. Because, you see,
Since the device they're using is a device conceived for individual usage, and since they have the idea that this device creates a bubble of immunity around them, well, they actually feel alone even if they're not. They feel isolated even if they're not. By the simple fact that they're using a device that is characteristically conceived in order to bestow a feeling of immunity on communication. But there is more, and we're going to reflect more about these aspects, contradictory aspects that come from the fact that this characteristically individual device is more and more used in order to create digital communities. We have talked for other 4 to 5 minutes now, so it's time for us to stop the second section of our class, and we're going to resume exactly at 10 a.m. here in Germany, 6 hours later Beijing time. So we'll stop now and resume in exactly 10 minutes. Thank you very much.